In his 2000 comics novel, Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth, Chris Ware employs complicated panel designs to reflect his two main characters' unfortunate, ineffective interactions with women, in which they often wander into fantasy. The Jimmy of the novel's present entertains fantasies with several women throughout the novel. In the late 19th century, James Corrigan regularly engages in fantasies about the red-headed girl. In their fantasies, both Jimmy and James, through Ware's presentation of the female form, envision sexualized versions of the female subjects of their fantasies. Jimmy and James effectively bring into play Laura Mulvey's ideas on the male gaze, which she describes as a projection of fantasy onto the female form, which is styled accordingly, in which women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness. Mulvey elaborates on the effect of the male gaze, arguing that woman displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle. She holds the look, plays to, and signifies male desire. Her visual presence tends to work against the development of a storyline, to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. This alien presence then has to be integrated into cohesion with the narrative. Along with this complicated page layouts and panel designs, Ware's presentation of Jimmy's and James's perception of women underscores the characters' ineffectualness with women, as well as their tendency to confuse fantasy with reality during their interactions with the opposite sex. Through Jimmy's and James's sexualization of the female form, they create fantastical scenarios in which they are unable to properly communicate with women, leading to failed interactions and contributing to the generally tragic arc of the characters. The novel's first instance of gaze-related sexual fantasy occurs when the present-day Jimmy is on the airplane en route to rendezvous with his father. Jimmy sits next to a woman and engages in what is ultimately banal, shallow conversation. The scene's first page features Jimmy as the panel's primary focus, but the woman is partially in view as well. The camera depicts one of her breasts. Ware effectively offers this image of Jimmy and the woman's breast to set up the following page's denouement. The following page depicts the woman in much the same manner. The page's first panel offers another glimpse of the curves of her right breast, and the third panel zooms out to offer a vision of her legs as well. The fifth panel is the scene's only instance in which Ware presents the woman's head, but she is looking at Jimmy, who is located in the panel's background. Thus, the reader never sees the woman's face. Although Jimmy and the woman seem engaged in quasi-friendly conversation, the scene is ultimately empty. Furthermore, as typical for the novel, it ends messily for Jimmy, and the woman accuses him of staring at her breasts. Ware's inclusion of a basket of fruit in this scene is curious. Fruit basket is a slang term for the tucking of the penis and testicles behind the legs to create the appearance of a vagina. Ultimately, this scene, as it ends with the accusations of Jimmy's visual misconduct, is emasculating, much in line with the slang consideration of the term. In this sense, Ware's inclusion of the fruit basket is likely a purposeful move. During the scene, Jimmy delves into the realm of fantasy. In the scene's first panel, Ware depicts him as the Cyclops robot, whose head with one eye, incidentally, resembles a camera. Jimmy enters the scene in the midst of fantastical thought. Additionally, a logo for Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth, resides in the center of the page and bleeds into the scene's first two panels. This further suggests Jimmy's tendency to delve into fantasy. He projects himself into a seemingly celebrated status, which, as his interactions with the woman on the airplane suggest, he clearly is not. Another instance of Jimmy's complicated negotiation of fantasy and reality occurs at the MedLife clinic after he gets hit by the postal truck. Over the span of 4 pages, Jimmy interacts with and ultimately fantasizes about sex in a long-term relationship with the nurse, whose primary function in the scene is to obtain a urine sample from Jimmy. Ware seemingly takes care to present the nurse as a sexual object in Jimmy's perception. Not once does Ware offer a full view of her face. The first panel in which the nurse appears offers a shot of her midsection as she enters the room, and the nurse's second panel features her looking away from the camera as Jimmy examines her backside. Arguably, considering Jimmy's ensuing sexualized visions of the nurse's breasts and lips, in this panel he is examining the nurse's buttocks. Ware offers 2 panels of the nurse's hands with pink-painted fingernails and pink and blue bracelets, further feminizing and thus sexualizing the nurse for Jimmy and the reader, before displaying the nurse at the first of her 2 strikingly sexualized moments. The nurse, bending over before Jimmy, seems to allow her scrubs to open up at the chest, presenting for Jimmy the white of her bra. This image is presented from Jimmy's perspective. Jimmy functions as the camera, examining the nurse as a sexual object. Later in the sequence, Jimmy's perception of the nurse again strongly suggests sexualization. The nurse puts her finger to her pink lipsticked lips. The nurse's lips appear at the top of the panel, and Ware, through Jimmy's perception, does not offer the rest of her face to the reader. Ware, via Jimmy, offers readers one more glimpse of the actual as the nurse leaves the room, but again, the view is of the nurse's posterior. From there, Jimmy leaves the world of the actual and enters the realm of the fantastical. The pink from the nurse's lips and fingernails becomes the background for Jimmy as he realizes his attraction to the nurse, signified by the emanating hearts. The subsequent panels hint at Jimmy's sexually aroused psychophysiological state, and Jimmy begins what is ultimately a sexual and romantic fantasy. The nurse, at least in the fantasy, returns and engages Jimmy in sexual conduct, and the panel suggests that the nurse manually stimulates Jimmy. The nurse mounts Jimmy before whispering, "Let's go someplace where I can really give you an examination." The fantasy proceeds with the nurse leading Jimmy out of the room, and the two ostensibly drive somewhere else and fornicate before the nurse cooks eggs for Jimmy. The relationship progresses quickly, and as the ensuing panels show the two on a walk with their pet dog, Jimmy putting a ring on the nurse's hand in the act of proposal, and an image of a small cabin in the mountains, likely where Jimmy imagines the two would share the rest of their lives together. As the fantasy progresses and reaches its climax, the panels become smaller and smaller. Arguably, this is Ware's device for suggesting the end of the fantasy and return to the actual world of the clinic. As the fantasy dwindles, so does the panel size. And the following panel features Jimmy back in the examination room as his father causes a tumult, effectively jolting Jimmy back into reality. The nurse's presentation as a sexual object reinforces Jimmy's troubled negotiations with women, but the fantasy's extension to include the less sexualized, more romantic aspects of a relationship underscores the tragic, crippling loneliness that Jimmy regularly experiences. Jimmy's difficulty in negotiating the actual and fantastical during his interactions with women extends to his relationship with Amy as well. In particular, the fantasy immediately following the drawn-out scene in which Jimmy and Amy discuss and leaf through pictures of their father reinforces Jimmy's tendency toward fantasy. Jared Gardner notes, "When Jimmy finally meets Amy, he can only write her into his well-worn adolescent sexual fantasies." As Jimmy sits alone, he imagines a scenario of global nuclear annihilation in which he and Amy are the only people left on Earth. As the explosion happens, Jimmy envisions himself acting courageously as he shelters Amy from the blast, and several panels later, consoles her as she bemoans their fate as nuclear winter appears to have set in. The ensuing panels present Jimmy playing the role of the patriarch, chopping down trees to collect wood for, as the reader discovers, a cabin in which he, Amy, and their infant child ostensibly reside. In the post-apocalyptic world of Jimmy's fantasy, Amy appears in tattered clothes, holding their baby. Although the tattered clothes are certainly a result of the labors of survival after the nuclear event, they also function to sexualize Amy, as they resemble, more or less, a bikini. That Amy holds a child implies that she has actually become a sexual object, and the reader can easily determine that, at some point, Jimmy and Amy have engaged in the sexual act. Although Jimmy does not produce a fantastical rendition of their coitus, the implication that the sexual act did occur further illustrates his inability to establish and maintain a healthy relationship with women. Furthermore, Jimmy's nuclear apocalypse fantasy occurs immediately after what, for Jimmy, should have been a productive, edifying experience, bonding with a sister he never knew he had over a father he never knew they shared. Jimmy's fantasy and its subordinate sexualization of Amy ultimately disrupts his attempt to make sense of the actual, and it portends the disruption of their relationship toward the novel's end. Like the other women who become the objects of Jimmy's sexual fantasies, Amy leaves him unfulfilled, and their relationship becomes yet another in Jimmy's catalog of failures. Although Jimmy is responsible for many of the novel's fantasies, James Corrigan, Jimmy's grandfather, engages in sexual fantasies in the novel's past, the Chicago at the end of the 19th century. The primary object of James's fantasies is the red-headed girl, who the World's Fair construction workers identify as the McGinty girl, and she functions as a sexual object in two of James's masturbatory fantasies. The first occurs toward the end of James's fantasy, in which he chops down trees, as Jimmy does in the nuclear apocalypse fantasy, to build a cabin. James rescues the red-headed girl from bandits and brings her back to the cabin where, over the sequence of small panels at the page's bottom, he nurses the girl. Eventually, In the fourth panel, his gaze lands on the red-headed girl's breasts, and in the page's final panel, he, in the fantasy, acts on his sexual inclinations and unbuttons her dress. Later in James's story, as he dreams, he envisions the naked body of the red-headed girl, and he follows her in the foreground of the buildings of the World's Fair. Ware presents an image of the red-headed girl's buttocks, reinforcing her sexualization in James's perception. In a bizarre reversal of traditionally gendered sexual roles, however, the red-headed girl takes on the dominant masculine role, as James assumes a position of exposed submission. Not only does James's dream function as a projection of his sexual inadequacy, but it reinforces his effeteness with the opposite sex and connects him to Jimmy in shared experience. Ultimately, James's sexualized imaginings, as with Jimmy's, are unproductive and contribute little toward the development of a healthy relationship with the opposing gender. It should be noted, though, that James Corrigan, ostensibly at some point in his life, has sex. Jimmy, as his descendant, is proof positive. Although James and Jimmy inhabit worlds temporally set a century apart, they possess the shared experience of failure in their interactions with women. Both characters, as part of their ineffectualness, possess the tendency to delve into fantasy, and Ware recounts several fantastical episodes through his trademark complicated, complex page layout and panel designs. In these fantasies, James and Jimmy gaze upon the female body, infusing it with sexuality. This sexualization functions as a disruption in the character's formations of coherent, healthy relationships with the opposing women in the realm of the actual. Georgiana Bonita elaborates on this idea, noting that the tendency toward fantasy and lack of engagement with the world are part of Ware's deft translation of the actual into multiple deferrals and repetitions as the narrative falters. Ultimately, these fantastical projections of the female body hinder James's and Jimmy's sexual and emotional growth and reinforce each character's arc of failure.